Hi there, I'm Kevin Gentry, and welcome to the Going Big podcast, where we'll explore some of the strategies that can help you transform your effectiveness by 10xing your fundraising. Each week, we'll sit down with some of the most influential business leaders, CEOs, and nonprofit visionaries to talk about leadership, the power of giving, and how you can make a real impact. If you want to make a transformational change to the cause you're working on, this is the place for that conversation. Also, take a look at our website, 10xstrategies.com. That's TENX strategies.com for lots of free marketing and fundraising resources. And be sure to sign up for the free weekly fundraising tips. Now, let's dive in. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so pleased to have with me today my friend Daniel Di Martino, who has a remarkable story frankly, about an appreciation and realization of the American dream and how it relates to so many ideas and areas of conflict in the world. And then his notion of going big here in the United States at a relatively young age, he's 25 now, about how he could take the message of our nation's founding, the message of freedom, much more widely to key audiences. So I don't want to step on the surprise. I want him to tell his story. Daniel, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. You were born in Venezuela in 1999 when Nicolas Maduro seized control of the government, took control, and really took Venezuela on a bad course. Just tell us your story. You can begin wherever you want and about your upbringing, the situation in Venezuela with your parents before you were born, and then where it is today.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you about, what people know of Venezuela today is that it's a country that is destroyed, that is very poor, that is very oppressive. But I think it's important to remember where we were before, so that we understand where we are. And where we were before is that Venezuela used to be the richest nation in Latin America. It used to be a normal country. And with normal, I mean you could get a job and not be poor and feed yourself and have a house and have a car and, maybe have a vacation once a year, have running water, have electricity, being able to send your kids to school where they could then go to college, and that would be normal in Venezuela, even for people who grew up in poverty, even for immigrants who didn't speak the language, in a very similar way to how that is normal today in the United States. Um, and that was the case for my family. My grandparents immigrated from Europe in 1956 and 57, in the late 50s, to Venezuela from Italy and from Spain. And they didn't finish high school. None of them even had any high school education. They went through elementary and I think some middle school for some of them. And then they just sent remittances to their families who were very poor. In fact, I went to my great grandmother's apartment in Spain, which is still there, and we still own it, their family. I don't really know who owns it, but there's too many kids in the family, but it's empty and we're able to be there. And I found all the letters that my grandfather sent to his mom every month from 1956 until the late 80s. And then there were less frequent letters in the 90s and the early 2000s because now we had, cheap phone calls. And so he didn't need to send letters. And in the letters, it's where he sent the checks too. And that is a very special thing because for me, it symbolizes how rich Venezuela was relative to the rest of the world, where, today it's people from Latin America. And that's the thing that most people remember. Oh, it's the Mexicans who come to the US to send remittances back to Mexico. But there was actually a country in Latin America where people went and they sent remittances out of our country to Europe. And that's what Venezuela was. And all of that began really to end in the 70s when the democratic governments back then nationalized the oil industry, really increased the footprint of the state very powerfully. But we're still a democracy. The economy just stagnated from the 70s on to the 90s. And that's when the year I was born, 1999, Hugo Chavez took office, a new president from a new political party. He created then his own coalition called the Socialist United Party of Venezuela, and that was Chavez. And Maduro was his, one of the many disciples that he had, and he's the current dictator.
Yes,
From the
I
moment I was born,
misspoke. I misspoke when I said Nicolas Maduro took over in 1999. Of course, it was Hugo Chavez, and
it's all
Maduro
the same
was his.
government anyway.
Yeah.
Really, we haven't had a change in government since 1999. And that's when, they embarked on a reform of the constitution. They completely rewrote it. They centralized power away from the states to the central government. They, destroyed the Senate. We used to have a Senate like the United States. They abolished the Senate. They changed everything. The elections, everything was changed. And ultimately, it also allowed the president to begin the process of nationalization. So they began taking people's private companies. They put price caps on goods. And for me as a kid, what it felt like growing up is that, you remember you had this favorite yogurt that you used to buy in the grocery store, and suddenly, what happened to that yogurt? You haven't seen it in months, and then you forget about it, and then you remember it like a few years later. What happened to that yogurt? It just disappeared from the shelves. Then you go a week without milk, and you're not sure why when you are in elementary school. Then you suddenly start getting some blackouts. Then they send you home from school in middle school with a note to your parents saying, if you need toilet paper for the bathroom, you need to bring it yourself because there's no toilet paper in school. And that's like the funny story about socialism. It's always like toilet paper, but it's really everything. The toilet paper is just what people laugh about. But it really wasn't funny for us going through it. It's funny now because I don't have that need. But that's what happened, and things just got progressively worse. The blackouts that used to happen maybe once a month then became once a week, and then several times a day sometimes. Sometimes we'll go a day without electricity, and you'd say, well, what's a big deal with a day without electricity? Actually, it's a big deal if you have things in your fridge. And what happens to the food that you have in your fridge? Well, in a country where there's food shortages on top of the blackouts, it's an even more serious deal that there is a blackout. And, thank God in my family, we were not diabetic. But if you're diabetic and you need to keep your insulin in the fridge, it's a life-threatening issue, the blackout. And so water shortages, that was very common. So, for example, I could only shower at certain hours in the morning. The government began rationing our food in really crazy ways. Like they told us which day of the week we could go to the grocery store. They told us what we could buy, how much of it we could buy. My mom used to, at the same time of this was happening, it's at the beginning of this process, a lot of people agreed with the government. Later on, fewer and fewer people did as they saw the consequences, but the elections became more rigged over time, and so they stayed in power. But I remember my mom being in the grocery store, and I used to go with her. And I actually hated going to the grocery store because of the experience, but I'm happy I did because I learned so much. And she would reply when somebody asked her, oh, how many pieces of meat can we take with us today? Like based on the rationing. And she always pulled out like a fake book on her hand. She would make this gesture and say, let me check on my Cuban rationing book, how much we are allowed to take by our dear government. In a sarcastic way, mocking the Cubans and what they did. It was a political statement for her, right? And so that's what it became. My family went from, because of the inflation that we had on top of this, we went from making $3,000-$4,000 a month in the early 2000s to $100 a month in 2016. That's really what best summarizes our destruction.
Well, for the benefit of our listeners, I wonder if you could go into a little more detail first about the economic depravity, the economic collapse that a result of what we know to be failed socialist political and economic policies, but match that up with the political repression, the elimination of the rights of political expression, free speech, the ability to challenge, even to challenge at the ballot box by taking away essentially the right to vote. And we've seen in the most recent elections in Venezuela the most outrageous abuse, where anyone would contend that the opposition won by a whopping margin, and the incumbent government claimed, of course, that they won. So if you would first, I think a number of us have seen some of the footage of Hugo Chavez when he would very ostentatiously talk about nationalizing businesses. There's footage of him saying, "What is that over there?" And someone would say, "That's a jewelry store." And he'd say, "Nationalize that." "What is that over there?" "That is a shoe store." Nationalize that. And of course, the people not understanding this would applaud, saying, this is somehow going to bring all of these things to the people. If you would, go a little bit deeper first into the economic consequences of the actions that first Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro continued to take, and how that took such an enormously prosperous country like Venezuela, where the standard of living was very high, as you say, to this situation of near depravity where people are begging to get out and doing everything they can to escape.
Yeah, so it all began with land nationalization. For some reason, socialist throughout history have always been obsessed with agriculture. In Venezuela, it was a especially funny thing because it's probably the least agricultural of all the socialist nations that have been taken over, in part because the oil production had taken over so much of the economy that the country had industrialized and urbanized so quickly. In fact, back then, it was the most urbanized Latin American country. Like 90% of the population lived in cities or suburbs, not in rural areas. In fact, more urban than the US itself. And the reason, we still had agriculture, but it just wasn't a meaningful part of the economy. And he began by taking over large landowners and then small landowners, giving it to quote unquote the workers. The thing that really happened is that the government would manage the farms and employ workers. The government would not have the right incentives to have a functioning farm, and it would just become an abandoned field that was just desertic. And so that I could see that everywhere. You could see in the highway big signs that said in a big red heart, "Made in Socialism," and it would be all empty, and it all decrepit and destroyed. It's the perfect picture of what they really did. And so, think about the incentives for a minute, right? What does a government, even in a democratic country, I'm not even saying in a totalitarian regime, in a democratic country, the government or the politicians who run the government, right? That's who runs the government. They want to maximize their votes. They want to stay in power. And so to do that, if they have a farm, people have a right to food, Kevin. If they have a right to healthcare, they surely have a right to food. Food is much more essential than anything else. What about a right to water? Do you want people to die of thirst? That's why you don't want the government to provide free water? And so that's exactly what they did. They provided free food, they provided free water. Because their nationalized companies were not enough, they took over everything, right? I'm not talking just farms, I'm talking banks, I'm talking cement companies, I'm talking manufacturing, I'm talking even restaurants. They would set up in the highway. It was called, have you heard of the Venezuelan arepa, our main staple food? So many people might have heard of this because of our diaspora that is so big now. But this is just a traditional meal. And there would be restaurants dedicated to making arepas. And you would stop for an arepa, like a taco restaurant, right? And so the government opened socialist arepa places on the street. I'm just going to tell you, you do not want to eat a socialist arepa. And so why? Because it was free. The workers did not have any incentive to do a good job because they wouldn't be fired. The managers did not have an incentive to run a profit. They had an incentive to just, keep things going and open, and that's it, and work the least possible. And for the government, they didn't have an incentive to make money. They could just print it. For them, it was just free things, hire as many people as you can, no matter what work they're doing. And the reason you want to hire as many people is that you want to grow the size of government so that then you can push those government employees to vote for you. And that's what they did. They created new government agencies, so many new ministries and departments, so many sub-ministries, so many regulatory agents that would be opportunities for corruption, of course, that bribes everywhere from government officials, from police to municipal governments, everything. judges, of course. And the consequence was that the economy breaks down, right? You as a private investor, why would you open a company in a country that they can take it at any minute? Not only can they take it at any minute, but if they don't take it, they can tell you how much you can charge for your product. And if they tell you how much you can charge, then you stop selling it. That's why we had shortages.
Well, this
That-
is
yeah.
Daniel. Thank you for these illustrations. And sadly, Venezuela, certainly over the years, with respect to Argentina, certainly with respect to Cuba, places like Nicaragua, certainly also countries in Africa like Zimbabwe, and what we saw, of course, in Eastern Europe after World War II by the Soviet Union. You just see, we know that the sort of top-down, centralized government approaches to the distribution of resources don't work by definition. I mean, it's just all the elements we know about human behavior and human action that this is what it leads to. But at least, again, sadly, in Venezuela, you can show to the world this was a highly prosperous country that went to the depths of stagnation and poverty because of this action. But if you would, before we move on to really what you did as a result of this, talk for a moment about the political efforts that generally coincide with these actions, and that is the suppression of dissent, the suppression of any kinds of free expression, and of course, worst of all, not just the suppression, but the persecution of those who oppose the state. We know of the horrible prison that exists there. Just for the benefit of our listeners, tell us a little bit more about what happened in Venezuela with respect to free speech and expression and the whole democratic process.
Well, a lot of people think that economic freedom is not related to political freedom. And let me give you a really pointed and detailed example of how it is. In Venezuela, before they banned newspapers, they just ran out of paper to print because the government took over the paper industry. And so how would you have freedom of expression for a newspaper if you can't even print? They don't have to ban you. They just stops you from printing. They regulated the airwaves over what can be shown for radio, and they didn't even need to legally shut you down as a radio station. And they can put themselves on TV. They bought even the private news channels. There was no freedom of expression, only online. And that is because, unlike Cuba, we already had internet when this government took over. And so they haven't been able to shut down the internet completely. They did recently ban Twitter, but you can use a VPN. But it is true that most people are not just, informed enough to do it or really care enough to do it. And so they are definitely censoring information. And, every time somebody opposes the regime, there are now very clear consequences. There have been cases where an old lady who was making jokes on TikTok was disappeared because she was making jokes about government officials. Very funny ones, by the way, but just for innocuous things. My friend Maria Oropesa, who was an election observer in this past July 28th election in Venezuela, she was taken from her home a week after the election by secret police without any sort of order. And even if they had an order, these are all fake judges. Everything is fake. There's no legality in Venezuela. Anybody who tries to fight through any legal process is really dumb. There is no legal process. A judge who says something against the government is arrested themselves. Any attorney or any district attorney, for example, or state attorney that refuses to indict protesters is indicted himself. And so the incentives are so well set up so that everybody follows the line. And the people who don't end up at political prisons and places where people are tortured with electricity, with water, with just insects and trash and human feces and a lot of terrible things. One of the very famous places is a place that was supposed to become a mall. It was abandoned and then it was turned into this police headquarters called El Helicoide. That's where Maria Oropesa is likely being held. There are now other common prisons that were recently turned by Maduro after the election into political prisons. where he even showed a video of about 30 young men walking and making like a military march and then making a salute, a Nazi-like salute to him, and saying some sort of socialist slogan. And those 30 young men were actually protesters against him who were forced to do all of this against their will, forced to make this political expression, and are likely being tortured, right? And that's why they're doing it. And so it is just really horrible, really sad. I'm not going to describe in detail anything else that they do, but you can look it up. You can really Google it, what tortures that they do to political prisoners
Well,
in
thank you.
Venezuela.
On
And there are
that note,
thousands.
yeah, Daniel, on that point, to those who might be listening and say, well, this is just crazy. This is not occurring in the world today. What is the best way for someone to verify the information that you're sharing?
Yeah, I would say there is a project that does even a VR headset of what happens inside El Helicoide. So if you just Google El Helicoide, and that is Helicoide is HELICOIDE. Just Google that. You will find plenty of information online from many verifiable sources. Even the United Nations Human Rights Council, which I really personally despise, even its president, Michelle Bachelet, who used to be, it's true, really a friend of the regime, has acknowledged all of these things are happening in Venezuela. Amnesty International, which is even a lefty really organization, acknowledges everything that's happening in Venezuela, the tortures, the violations of human rights. Another, human rights aren't just the right to protest or to free speech. The right to own your farm is a human right. Private property is a human right. People forget about this. The very first famous case of a protest against Chavez was a hunger strike by a farmer whose farm was taken. His name was Jose Brito, and he went on hunger strike, and he died on hunger strike because they never returned his family farm. He wasn't a large landowner that they took a farm that he wasn't living in. He was a normal farmer that they took his livelihood away, and he died for that cause. He died for private property.
Well, Daniel, thank you for sharing all this. And I know that it is painful for you even to go through this. One more question, and then now we want to get to what maybe can be done. But we know that there has been a horrific refugee crisis at the border of the United States, and many of these people are coming from Venezuela because they're fleeing a horrible situation. So there are consequences of this directly for the United States as well. Would you just offer just a quick comment on that, and then we'll go to your solution to this effort?
Yeah, I would say that it is true that a lot of people are coming, and I think that a lot more people will keep coming. A lot more people will leave Venezuela. Part of it is really that people haven't just come to the States. There are 2.5 million Venezuelans in Colombia. There are nearly 2 million in Peru. There's 500,000 in Ecuador, 500,000 in Brazil, 500,000 in Argentina, 500,000 in Spain. And I think there's right now about 1 million in the US between everyone.
And just to understand that, how many people have been estimated to have left Venezuela because of the horrific conditions?
The total number is 8 million, and likely we are going to reach at any moment 9 million.
Which is a quarter of the population, right? That's
it's over 30% now. It's over 30%. So imagine over 30% of the U.S. population would be 90 million, about 90 million, 30% of the U.S. population. 90 million people is not just the West Coast states, it's like all the mountain states plus the West Coast, like everywhere west of the Mississippi, something like that, because most of the population lives east of the Mississippi.
Well, so your parents fled Venezuela, came to the United States when?
No, they went to Spain. They went
to Spain. How did you come to the United States?
I came in 2016 because I had a full ride scholarship from Indiana University. I had learned English in Venezuela through private classes with other friends, with our English teacher from school. We paid her. We went to her house in the afternoons, and that's how I learned. And then reading and video games and all of that. And then I took the SAT, and I did well. I didn't do Ivy League well, but I did well enough to get a full ride out of state college. And that's how I came to the States. I lived in Indiana for a little over 3 years, then moved to Kentucky for work. Then I moved to New York City for my PhD in economics at Columbia University.
So you're completing a PhD in economics at Columbia. At some point, I'd like you to speak about that. But tell us about the Dissident Project. So this comes us to going big. I mean, you've obviously seen, witnessed, felt, experienced in multiple ways this horrific situation, but you're not just sticking your head in the sand or trying to ignore it and move on to a better life in the United States. You're trying to raise the alarm, especially among young people who don't hear about this sort of situation in the world. Tell us about the sort of vision you have for expanding the view of freedom and sharing this story more broadly.
Yeah, so well, when I came to the States, I noticed that there were a lot of people who didn't understand what was happening in Venezuela. And of course, why would they, right? I mean, most Venezuelans don't understand what happens in other countries. So, like, why would Americans understand what happens in other countries? Most people don't even understand what happens in their own country. How would they understand something else? And so I thought that that was a problem, though, because not because of Venezuela's acknowledgement, but because there are people pushing really bad ideas in the US who I think we need to stop. People who want to turn this country into something like Venezuela. And I don't mean that as an exaggeration. I mean that very literally, that I think there are politicians, including, Bernie Sanders, Ilhan Omar, AOC, who openly blame the US for what happens in Venezuela. They only have now acknowledged some of the human rights violations of the dictatorship, but we're not even calling it a dictatorship until a couple of years ago. And we're even saying that we were doing some sort of fascist coup against Maduro and Chavez before. We're saying that Venezuela was the American dream. And then they propose here the same ideas that bankrupted Venezuela and could bankrupt us too in the United States. And I don't want that to happen to me in another country. So this is in part that I love the people of the US, but I also don't want to live in another Venezuela, and I don't want to have to leave another country. It's a little self-interested too. And so there's so many stories of people who have fled a country and then have had to flee again, and their children fled another country. I don't want that to happen to my generations, okay? And so I started Dissident Project because I saw there was a vacuum that the government wasn't going to solve, where American kids were graduating school and going to colleges where they're being indoctrinated into Marxist ideas of several kinds, cultural Marxist ideas mostly, right, about race and gender, but also economically Marxist ideas, which is where all this comes from, right? Every disparate impact is discrimination. We need equality of results, not equality even of under the law, but they want actually inequality under the law to achieve their ends. And so I thought that the best way to counter this narrative is to tell students, actually, this isn't even something of the past. This is happening right now. Socialism is happening right now. This is not the Soviet Union. This is not Mao in China in the 60s or the 50s. This is right now, today. People are being tortured in a socialist country for implementing the same ideas because they disagreed with them. They have become very poor when they were very rich. And the average person in a socialist country doesn't become a political prisoner. I didn't. My family didn't. The average person just becomes poor and destitute. And that's what we need to tell the American students, because that's what will likely happen to them. They're likely not going to be the political prisoner. They're just going to be another destitute person. And the best way to do that is not through a history book. It's not through a video. It's not through their teacher. It's through the person that lived it and now lives in the States. And because we can't send them to Cuba, right? It would be too expensive and too dangerous. But we can send the Cubans to them. And so that's what Dissident is. We are a speakers bureau that sends immigrants who escaped totalitarian countries 2 high schools all over the US at no cost.
Well, Daniel, we know, first of all, from history, there's the, hockey stick of human progress that for much of our existence in the world, life was nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes described it. And until really the founding ideas of the United States, the ideas of freedom and self-government spurred this enormous, extraordinary prosperity, which has brought so many people out of poverty, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. And yet, as you say, these ideas are still prevalent and this course still occurs. And at the time of our conversation today, we are only a few weeks away from the American elections. And if, for example, Kamala Harris and the Democrats were to sweep the table, win the House and Senate and the White House, many of them have said openly that they would, in effect, pursue similar policies. On the one hand, on economic policy, the Green New Deal, wealth tax, many things which are the equivalent of nationalizing businesses, the route that was taken, which would lead to greater economic stagnation and ultimately depravity. And then also, they've said that they would use the occasion to eliminate the Senate filibuster, pack the Supreme Court by adding 4 new progressive justices, going from 9 to 13, and then beginning to eliminate our freedom of speech and change election laws. So it's the same, as you say, same approach. If you would, what is the message precisely that you're sharing today, and how is it being received? I mean, you can speak from personal example. I can't speak in the same way that you can, but are there those who just can't understand it? Do they doubt you? Is it too much to comprehend? What's happening when you share this message?
Well, for most of the students, they just didn't know anything about it. And so it's the first time they encounter a message even against socialism. And that is a good thing, right? Because we want them to think about this when they get the positive message about socialism, right? So I'll give you an example. There are some kids in like very high-end schools who are already being indoctrinated at the high school level. And I went to one of those high schools. Actually, I'm not sure how I got invited there and they wanted me, but I went. It was in DC, a private high school. And I spoke there. And even some kids literally asked me if what happened to Venezuela was all done as part of a CIA operation to sabotage the socialist government. I even laughed about that one because this is like Maduro regime level of narrative, right? The CIA did it. You know, they even accused Marco Rubio of causing blackouts remotely from Miami. Marco Rubio is one of the few US senators with Secret Service or like extra protection because he's under threat by the Venezuelan regime of being murdered. So because he's a big advocate against them. And so, you know, I was able to debunk that. I was able to debunk that in front of students who had a teacher whose classroom had a picture of Che Guevara in a public school in North Carolina. And I was able to tell them about, and the teacher even asked me a question in front of them. He asked me, don't you think that capitalist countries are rich because of colonization and they just extracted resources from poor countries, and that's why rich countries are rich and poor countries are poor? Now, this is classic like Marxist narrative. And I said, well, you know, first, the US was a colony, not a colonizer. But second, you know, how did South Korea and Japan become rich countries when they were destitute after World War II? None of them, I mean, South Korea didn't have slavery. They were enslaved by the Japanese. How did Singapore become a rich country? How did they become not just rich countries in this time frame, but they're richer than European nations? They did it because they're free, not because they have resources, not because they colonized, not because they enslaved anyone. In fact, there's actually very much good evidence that the South today is poorer because of slavery, not just blacks, whites too, that it was a really inefficient institution, not just an inhumane and wrong institution. And so these are some things that is important to tell students, and I was able to bring that point of view. My hope is that every high school in the US will be able to, at one point, have somebody from a tyrannical country tell their story to them. Because this is really, I'm not trying to push people to be Republican. I'm not trying to push people to to vote for someone. I'm trying to push people to support free enterprise. And if they do it in the Democratic Party, that's a good thing. You know, people need to understand that America has a bipartisan system, right? Democrats are going to govern, Republicans are going to govern. Sometimes they're going to have a trifecta. Most of the time, nobody will. And that means that you don't want to have one political party that is a socialist party, because you don't want the country moving in that direction. And so we need to, push those people out within the Democrats, and we also need to push people out who are against free enterprise within the Republicans too. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm pushing for, at least on a personal level. And Dissident is just focused on sharing the stories of these immigrants, all of whom of us have different views too on many issues.
Well, it's quite remarkable for someone who, first of all, immigrated to the United States, came to school here, and at a young age had the idea to start something, not just yourself to go into college campuses, but to develop this whole project, the Dissident Project. Tell us about some of the other students, young people who are going on to campuses. Where are they from?
Yeah, so let me tell you about, Frances Hui. She was one of our original first class of speakers. She's from Hong Kong. She has the, I guess, honor of being the first political asylee granted asylum in the US after the 2019 protest in Hong Kong, because of the national security law. And so she's really a pro-democracy activist in Hong Kong. She has a 1 million Hong Kong dollar price on her head by the Chinese Communist Party for her arrest. There's an active warrant for her arrest. Her face is like on the street and on websites. So I'm very proud to have her. Grace Jo, she's from North Korea. And the most harrowing stories of oppression you will ever hear from North Korea, without a doubt. She grew up starving, really. Some of her family starved to death. She and her sister and mother were able to escape after several failed attempts crossing the border to China, thanks to a Christian American pastor who saved her and her family by hiding them in northern China until the UN was able to smuggle them out to the US. She even met George W. Bush, who's responsible for bringing a lot of North Korean refugees. She's really a wonderful woman. We have recently, actually, we added somebody else from Iran, Shai Katiri, who really was just an average Iranian college student who really wanted freedom and didn't have it, and didn't have economic opportunity or the choice to even study what he wanted in Iran, or write about his opinions. And he came to the US seeking that opportunity. And I think these stories are important because, okay, Frances was really a political activist. She's really high up there. But Grace was an average person. Shai was an average student too. I was an average person. And this is important because you will see on TV, you will see on YouTube, the stories of a lot of people who are really high profile. But the average person doesn't go through what high profile people go through. And I want the American kids to know what the average person in a tyrannical government goes through. Angus Mteklu, he's from Eritrea, a country that probably 95% of Americans have never heard about, unlike Iran or even Venezuela and North Korea. Eritrea is in the Horn of Africa, next to Ethiopia and Sudan. And it's also called the North Korea of Africa. It's illegal to leave Eritrea. Everybody's drafted for years on end into the military. There's no private property. Angusam has a really powerful quote that really hit me when he told us in the training, which is, I didn't know what choice was until I came to America. And he lived in a refugee camp for a few years in Ethiopia until he was able to get a visa to come to the US to study. And then he applied for asylum here. And I met him because he was a PhD student in Boston. I mean, this is a really smart guy who was able to get out. And I'm very happy for him and for the US.
Daniel, if listeners want to get involved with the Dissident Project, or maybe if they want to see about bringing you or one of your fellow speakers to their local community, to a high school, to a college campus, whatever it may be, what would you recommend they do?
So if you want to bring any of us or really get involved in any way, just go to dissidentproject.org. There you can contact us. You can either apply because you want to be a speaker, and then we'll get in touch with you when the time comes. You can book us for any high school or even middle school in the US at no cost. If it's too few students, we will do it virtually. But if it's at least 50 or 100, we will do it in person. And no matter where you are, you can be in Alaska, you can be in Hawaii, you can be in Maine, you can be in Texas, no matter where. Or speakers are everywhere too. And if you want to donate, you can also do it through our website, dissidentproject.org, and it's tax deductible.
Well, Daniel, I really applaud you. You could have gone the easier route with that Fulbright scholarship and just gotten your education and done whatever else, but out of your concern, you're going big, and really applaud you. And I think people are responding to that vision that you've cast. As we wrap up this conversation today, I'm just going to give you the opportunity to share whatever parting words that you might to anyone listening from your own personal story, whatever you would want us to hear.
Well, I think a lot of people think in the US that that this can't happen here. We cannot become a tyrannical country. But I think you said it very easily with the agenda that some politicians have, especially Supreme Court packing. I recently began a speech saying, what would you do if you wanted to become dictator of the United States? And I can tell you what I would do. What I would do is that I would pack the Supreme Court. You just need half of the House and half of the Senate to really pack the Supreme Court and eliminate the filibuster and then pack it. And it's totally legal and constitutional. And then once you control the court and put literally your friends, if you want, there's also no limit of who you can put in the Supreme Court. You control what the Constitution says, which means you control everything. You can abolish all the rights that we have. And it's actually, I think, a dangerous vulnerability in the US Constitution and in the US political system. And it's one that is ripe for exploitation. And so it does matter, and it can happen here. Do I think it will happen? No, but I'm not gonna just stand by and not do anything to make sure it doesn't happen. I will try to do all my best so that we don't lose the United States like we lost Venezuela.
Well, Daniel Di Martino, the Dissident Project, dissidentproject.org. Thank you very much for speaking out. And, it's been often said that one of the sad consequences that has worked somewhat to the benefit of the United States of all of the horrible situations where authoritarian socialist governments have taken away freedoms is the refugees come to the United States and speak out. And it's the most powerful way to hear about this terrible situation. It's just a terrible way for us to get that message. Thank you for doing it. Thank you for all that you're doing, and thank you for joining us today, Daniel Di Martino.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks for listening to today's Going Big podcast. Hopefully you were inspired to go big for your cause. Remember, this is all about transforming your effectiveness by 10xing your fundraising. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe or leave us a review at iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also catch this episode on YouTube. And also, there are lots of resources available to you at my website, which is 10xstrategies.com. That's TENXstrategies.com. You can sign up also for our free weekly fundraising tips. This is all about helping you get to the root causes of some of the biggest problems in society today by transforming your fundraising and your effectiveness. Thanks again. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.